You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Bill Thomas. Kristin Dilley, my podcast partner, is away on assignment, but she'll be back next time on Mind Over Murder with lots of enthusiasm and new stories to tell. So it's just me today. Together with me is Lisa Ribacoff, who, when you get to know her, she's just amazing. Has an incredible background, which I'll let her tell you about. Never forget the fact, in addition to being an accomplished professional, Lisa Ribacoff is also kind to children and small animals. You're going to absolutely love her. Lisa Ribacoff, welcome to Mind Over Murder.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate the accolade pertaining to small children and animals. I love them both.
Lisa, tell people about yourself. And don't be modest here. Just let it fly.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So thank you again, Bill, for having me. I am Lisa Ribacoff. I am a New York State licensed private investigator, as well as an advanced trained polygraph examiner. I have been a licensed private investigator now since, make me do math on demand. I would say the past 12 to 13 years, and also a polygraph examiner for the same amount of time. I currently serve on the board of directors of the American Polygraph Association as the seminar program manager, which means I run a 10-day seminar for pretty much our membership, as well as polygraph examiners that are interested in attending our annual seminar. And I'm also currently on the task force for the National Cold Case Task Force. So I definitely have my hands full. And I love everything that I do because it's about victim-centered advocacy and justice, whether it's through investigative skills or using the polygraph as an investigative tool. And again, thank you for having me here today.
Well, you've been all over the news lately because I'm seeing you commenting about the recent polygraph examination on camera, no less, of Casey Anthony's parents. You didn't work that case, but you did provide some media commentary, a fairly accurate representation?
Yes, that's correct. I did not directly work the Casey Anthony case at all and or administer the polygraph exams that were given to Casey's parents. What I decided to do was interact with my Twitter followers and kind of educate the general public. The idea came to me the night before, and I just said, you know what? I'm going to watch it. And then I'm going to go ahead and provide my expert commentary as to what exactly people are seeing. Because just because you see something doesn't mean you actually understand what's going on. So I paid for Hulu Plus TV, $79 for the month, because my cable package didn't have A&E as part of it. And I said, crap, how am I going to do this? So I went online, created an account, and I streamed it on my computer. So I had the documentary up on my laptop, and then I used a TV monitor as a computer. So I was sitting there going back and forth, live streaming and typing as the whole thing was going on. And that took about 2 hours of my life that I'm clearly not going to get back. But the feedback I had gotten was incredible,
right? Because
it became an educational experience and people were seeing it in real time of what exactly is going on. It was great because it obviously increased my Twitter following. So because that's really what I'm using to connect with everyone these days. And then the other side of it was people commenting, okay, this was great. When's the next one happening? And my only response was get someone to take a polygraph and have it either televised or put into a TV show, and I'll do the same thing. So until that happens, I guess I'm not going to be sitting in front of Twitter for 2 hours.
So before we talk about the Long Island serial killer Gilgo Beach 4 case, let's tell people what your Twitter handle is so they can follow you, because obviously there's a lot to be learned from someone with your level of expertise.
So my Twitter handle is very simple. It's just my first and last name, and I'll spell it for you because many people screw it up. It's Lisa, Lisa, and then my last name, Ribacoff.
You've also been very involved. I've seen you on a number of different platforms, television, podcasting, live breaks from our friend Joe Giacalone and others discussing the Long Island serial killer / Gilgo Beach 4, heaven forbid we could come up with one name that worked, case. What's your involvement there on the Gilgo Beach 4 case?
My involvement with the case is that I'm not an active investigator on their task force. I am not directly involved with the investigation. My role has turned into being a subject matter expert, given that I am a private investigator. I also live on Long Island, about 25 minutes away from Gilgo Beach. So because I was raised in the media towards when this investigation started, and I followed it closely, I've had just media outlets reach out to me and say, hey, can we have the commentary, or can we jump on a Zoom or a YouTube or a podcast recording to break down the bail documents, talk about maybe the demographics of Long Island, what's going on with the case, things like that. So I've got my hands on the pulse of what's going on over here.
Mm-hmm. And you're a legacy. I called your office the other day looking for you, and I ended up talking to your dad briefly, who was unbelievably nice. Also, I'm calling saying, I need to talk to Lisa urgently. Can you get a message to her? And at the end of the call, I said, may I ask who I'm speaking to? And he said, oh, this is her dad. Your dad is also a private investigator and polygraph examiner.
Yes, my dad is both, and that's how I got into the business. I started off doing private investigation work as an office assistant, where kids in high school would have normal upbringings and do sports and clubs and activities. And I'd be like, that's not fun. So I would leave my local high school, walk to his office, which was a few blocks away, stop in Dunkin' Donuts next door, get my donut and my chocolate milk, and go up to the office. And I would handle phone calls, or the surveillance agents would give in like their billing and their timesheets, and I would import it. And that's when I was 16. And I slowly moved my way up the rankings into being an office assistant, to being a surveillance coordinator, where we had agents in the fields and I'd have to contact clients and scheduling or handle investigations, and then go out and take statements in regards to witnesses or accidents or whatever we had going on. And then it turned into a surveillance operative, where I would be in the field doing surveillances. But now we're at the point where my dad and I are kind of partners in the business. He still owns it. I still follow the rules. And there's one day he's my dad, the next day he's my boss. So definitely creating an interesting dynamic. And family dinners, especially in public, are fantastic, because people overhear the conversation and they're like, I'm going to stop eating. I want to listen to what they're talking about.
I can imagine.
And my mom works in the business. My brother works in the business. So it's great to see the transition of me growing up, where even in elementary school, kids were like, oh, my dad's a doctor, my mom's a lawyer, or my dad's a policeman. And I'm like, my dad's a spy. My dad's James Bond. And I'd always had that cool thought of he's like an undercover spy, never like KGB or anything. I didn't go that far. But I was just like, dad's got like gizmos and gadgets and stuff. And so to be able to be raised in the business, grow in the business, as well as help grow the business to where we are now, has been such a great experience. And it's definitely made my dad and I as close as we are now.
It's not a normal upbringing, though, not by a long shot. Your life, even as a teenager, sounds completely different from most of the rest of us.
Yeah, it definitely was very different. It made it a lot more interesting, because especially like growing up, I had my own dating life in college and high school or whatever it was. For me, I always went into it with a radar, or like the light beam that was like figuring out who was good to date and who was bad to date. And then thinking, okay, I'm in college. Do I need to run a background check on this guy?
Oh,
what do
my
I think
gosh.
about this? It definitely added some fun to the mix, I guess you can say that. It all worked out in the end, and I'm very happy now, and I can only go up from there pretty much.
We've had a situation develop in the Colonial Parkway Murders that has resulted in our listeners coming forward with tons of questions about one of your many specialties, which is being a polygraph examiner, how polygraph examinations work. I need to tee this up a little bit with a bit of background about why so many people who are supporters of Mind Over Murder and those families, including mine, that were impacted by the Colonial Parkway Murders, why they're asking so many questions. It's come out in the last 2 weeks since the FBI and the Virginia State Police and the Hampton, Virginia Police Department announced that they had identified a suspect, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., who is deceased, he died in 2017, as the offender responsible for the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling, who were part of the Colonial Parkway murders. They were killed in 1987. And then another case which we were less familiar with because it wasn't part of the Colonial Parkway murders, and that was the murder of a lovely young woman named Teresa Howell in 1989, who was murdered by herself after likely meeting the offender in a bar called the Zodiac Club in Hampton, Virginia. What wasn't said was that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was also suspect number one in the disappearance and likely murder of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey in 1988 as part of the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, it's necessary to do a little bit of a recap here. The FBI received information after the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey and the discovery of Keith's Toyota Celica on the Colonial Parkway, about a mile or so from where my sister, Kathy Thomas, and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, had been found murdered a year and a half prior. Of course, in the meantime, then, a second couple, the aforementioned Robin Edwards and David Knobling, had also been murdered, not on the Colonial Parkway, but about a half an hour away at this place called the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge. The FBI knew they had a problem. They had two couples, one gay, one straight, who'd been brutally murdered. And now they had a missing couple and the car found on the Colonial Parkway just down the road from where the first incident took place. And the FBI immediately recognized they had a problem. They did a full court press, which the FBI is actually quite good at. They rented out every room in a hotel just off the Colonial Parkway, and they brought in a number of different agents and support staff. And one of the things that emerged almost immediately was that a number of people on the Colonial Parkway, remember this is pre-cell phone, pre-internet, so they're putting out an APB looking for information, but a number of people, including couples, reported that this very distinctive truck was cruising the Colonial Parkway that evening that Keith and Sandy went missing. And they described the truck. It was dark blue or dark green, writing on the doors, and a very elaborate mechanism on the back that kind of would look like a tow truck to my eye, but was actually the tongs that are used to pull crab pots and oyster from the ocean. And this, of course, is a big fishing, crabbing, and oystering area. So they knew they were looking for this truck. It kept coming up in reports that this truck had been seen cruising all of these little half-moon pull-offs along the Colonial Parkway. The agents who are communicating by radio, no cell phones back then, are discussing this a number of different times as more information comes in. During this time, a non-agent, the guy that maintained the radios, had heard all of the agents discussing this very distinctive vehicle, which is truly a one-of-a-kind. And he radioed in a couple of days after the investigation had begun and said, guys, I'm next to that truck on the highway. He described the truck and they said, that's the one. And now he gets the license plate, which is obviously incredibly helpful. It was a vanity plate and it said E.M. Raw, Edam Raw, which is a sexually suggestive joke, I would say, as well as an oyster reference, which is what this truck was set up to do. Now the FBI has the license plate, so they know where to find this guy. 4 days after Keith and Sandy went missing on the Colonial Parkway, two agents rolled up on this man's home, which is out in Lancaster, Virginia, a couple of hours away from the site where the disappearance had taken place. The agents were immediately concerned because they felt this man was engaged in very suspicious behavior. He's washing out his truck and repainting the surfaces inside the cab of the truck. And this is a real beater work truck. This isn't a fancy truck. They are immediately suspicious that this guy's up to something he shouldn't be. They spoke to him, interviewed him, and then they went away and immediately got a search warrant for his property. And they went back with a search warrant and searched. Sometimes we hear trailer, other times small, modest house. I think we're talking about the same structure without a doubt, that he shared with his brother. They knew they were looking for certain things. And as part of that search warrant, they discovered guns, handcuffs, an extensive collection of pornography. And of course, we've had profilers on Mind Over Murder who were just saying these are all red flags for the kind of person you'd be looking for in a murder series like the Colonial Parkway Murders. At some point shortly thereafter, they bring this man in for a polygraph examination. And we're told there may have been 2 polygraph examinations for this man and a second man who's not identified. So I'm not sure who that is. Could be the brother, could be someone else. But the polygraph examiner, who's one of the top people at the FBI, who has done all the top spy cases, there were a bunch of spy cases that broke back in the 80s and 90s at the Norfolk FBI field office because of the big military presence down there. They busted a number of spies. This same polygraph examiner gave the tests to those individuals. So this gentleman was very highly regarded. But here's where we get tripped up, and this is where you come in, Lisa. As we understand it, they gave a test or tests to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. and another unnamed man, and they passed the first examination. Now we're hearing they may have actually taken a second examination and the results were inconclusive. Regardless, they dismissed these men as suspects in the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey, despite all of this extensive circumstantial evidence. Further, as they continued to look at incidents on the Colonial Parkway, couples began coming forward and they reported that they had been attacked basically by this same gentleman driving this same truck, pulling them over, flashing his lights, demanding driver's licenses in a highly aggressive way, and trying to get couples to roll their windows down. And several couples actually feared for their lives. One couple was so terrified by this guy that they tried to drive away at a high rate of speed. He tried to block them with this same truck. They turned around and sped out of one of these half-moon pull-offs at a high rate of speed, and they were able to lose him when they finally got to Route 17, which is a nearby major road. There are all these scary incidents involving this man. When we look back, and I know hindsight's 20/20 and all that, I think to myself, why did they let this man go? But the answer to date seems to be, we gave him a polygraph exam, and at least he passed the first one, or they passed the first one. So walk us through polygraph examinations, if you would. And we're civilians here, and I know this is your area of expertise. Educate us a little bit, if you will, Lisa, on how polygraph examinations work.
So polygraph exams have been around for over 100 years. They started off as the analog instrument, which is typically what everyone sees in TVs or movies, where you have the contraption or the machine on the desk, and you see the paper rolling out the side, and you see the needles moving up and down. Through the course of the years, we have now transitioned from using analog to digital. And what digital is that it operates off a laptop computer. The instrument is pretty much about maybe half the size of a tissue box. It's just a little bit thinner. It has the different connector ports into it. And those are the different factors that we go ahead and measure, to which the data is then transmitted onto a laptop. And what we used to see on the pen and paper with the needles moving is now what we observe on the actual computer. The benefits of also transitioning to digital is the fact that we have scoring algorithms and scoring software built into the technology that we're using pertaining to the programs that we're using to acquire the data. And by data, the physiological reactions that the person provides in response to the question. So the person that's taking the test is going to be attached to 2 pneumographs. One sits on their chest and one sits on their stomach to measure 2 different sources of breathing, as some people breathe from their stomach and some people breathe from their chest and some people breathe from both. So we acquire breathing respirations from that. They also are wearing a blood pressure cuff in which we're monitoring the heart rate and blood flow with regards to the questions that are being asked. And then they're also going to be wearing 2 plates on their fingers, which measure the galvanic skin reactions, which is ultimately sweat gland response to the questions that are being asked on the exam. Because on the exam, we don't just ask relevant questions, meaning the questions about what the topic is, that the reason you're taking the exam. We're also asking you other types of questions to gear your reactions to those questions as well, in comparison to the relevant questions.
How does that tie into an investigation, for example? How are polygraph examinations and examiners tying into working with their investigative partners?
The polygraph is an investigative tool, and that's what I've always said. It's not the be all, it's not the end all. It is there to support your investigation and to support the findings that you have come across. There is a misconception that the polygraph is there to catch the guilty. I am very much a firm believer that the polygraph is there to clear the innocent. People have to go ahead and have a methodology to show that what they're saying is being truthful. For example, it's the fact if an individual could be accused of murder, they want to take the test to go ahead and show that they did not commit the murder. Same thing with regards to a theft. And even as something as simple as proving infidelity in a marriage or a relationship to show that infidelity didn't occur. So polygraphs can be issued when they are event-based and you're testing a situation. You can't test opinions, you can't test thoughts, you can't test emotions. Just for example, that your opinions and your emotions change. Whereas polygraphs, when you're testing events, you're testing with the idea of did something happen or did something not happen? And that's what we're going ahead and using it as an investigative tool to support the investigation.
How reliable is polygraph testing?
The exam reliability is constantly being researched by the researchers in our industry. It's been yielding pertaining to the metadata analysis to gain a 90 to a 93% accuracy. Most people think that, or they question why is it not 100% accurate? And I tell everyone bluntly, even when people call my office to ask about the accuracy, I said, nothing in life is 100% except the fact that you're born, you die, and you have to pay taxes. That's it. Because of scientific studies and different variables that come into play, we can go ahead and we can say between like an 88 to 93% accuracy pertaining to the exam.
So you can't stake your life on it, that's for sure.
You can't save your life, which is why it's an investigative tool. It is subjective to the point of it will provide you the necessary resources and information to take your investigation further pertaining to keeping it open or keeping it closed. But there is value and there is weight where it does get administered, such as in Rockville conviction cases where someone can file a 440 motion to vacate the conviction. It has been used plenty of times to go ahead and release someone from a criminal institution, jail or prison, wherever they are, for a crime that they did not commit.
So do you feel, I know you weren't a polygraph examiner back in the 80s. That was a long time ago.
I was barely born, sweetheart.
Do you feel that polygraph examinations back then, this would have been, 1988? So that's 36 years ago. Coming up, actually, because the exam was a little later in the year, as we understand it. What's your sense of the reliability of polygraph examinations in a pre-digital environment back in the 80s, let's say?
For me, it comes down to not necessarily the technology. It comes down more to the training of the examiner and the systems that are in place during not only just the pre-test interview, but as well as the chart collection. Because when you're dealing with technology, you have to take a look at a couple of different things. Number one, that analog instrument measures less components than we do now. Mm-hmm. An increased amount of data that we can acquire now versus then. Number two, the cleanliness of the charts. And what I mean by that is when you're dealing with the pen and paper, that's only one copy. If you mess that up, you spill coffee on it, you spill water, whatever it is, it tears, you lose your data. Versus now on the digital side, it gets saved into a computer. I can print out 150 copies of something if I wanted, and the data doesn't change. Also, you have the scoring methodologies that are built into the software. Whereas previously, there was no accountability for the examiner's ruling other than that one chart that was printed and torn off the machine, given to another examiner by hand. Now, again, we have the scoring, where we have a computerized, independent, unbiased opportunity for a scoring decision to be rendered by the computer. But we also have the opportunity for me to save the charts, download them, and email them to another examiner anywhere in the world that's a qualified examiner to run their own scoring decision.
And so he or she can help you by offering a second opinion, a third opinion, and you feel that wasn't really available using this earlier technology?
I don't know what the department protocols would have been, but I know where I've run analog tests just for demonstration purposes and what the charts look like. I'd have to rip it off the instrument, fold it up a certain way or roll it up a certain way, physically hand it to someone like I'm running the 4x4 in the Olympics on the track, where it looks like a baton. Wear and tear comes into play of the actual physical data and the chart. Because again, that's the only copy that you have. So I think it's also the transition, the wear and tear, whether they used heat, whether they used ink, that also comes into a factor. So there are a lot of different determinalities pertaining to not necessarily the accuracy of the exam, but my concern is pertaining to the control of the data and the transmission of the actual data itself from person to person or case file to case file.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Help us out, by the way, Lisa. Most of us, our experience with lie detection, or proper name, polygraph examinations, is from film and TV, as you mentioned. When I watch one of those tests being administered in a film or a television show, the examiner marks what looks like a paper roll sometimes with a pen or writing implement. What is he or she doing when they are making these marks?
For what you're seeing is an exam for demonstration and or media entertainment purposes. What they could be doing is they could be marking plus or minus as if they passed the question, or they could be doing chart markings, scoring, identifying possible maybe if someone took a deep breath or they sneezed or they coughed, because all those body movements, even though they're automatic, could affect the exam and affect the chart readings. They just want to notate any abnormalities that could be showing up in the chart. They could also be going ahead and just taking notes, maybe movement, body language, things like that. Or even going ahead and importing the plus or minus. Could be plus meaning they answered yes to the question, or the minus could be no. So unless I actually see what's going on and I can actually see what's happening, I really can't speak to it. But those are all just possible hypotheticals that could be taking place.
Right. Neither one of us is a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but
yes,
I have read a number of different times, and many of our listeners have asked this question: is it true in the literature that psychopaths or sociopaths can beat a polygraph?
There's a couple of different angles on this one. You're dealing with the psychology of an individual. We don't know if they're a psychopath per se or have psychiatric issues until we actually meet with the person and we do our pre-test interview and we ask about medications, medical conditions, and clear them just to make sure that they are eligible to take the exam. And that takes place at the time of the test. It also comes down to the training of the examiner to make sure that they ask the right questions to clear the individual to take an exam. So it does fall on the examiner training, and it also depends upon the scope of the questions that are being asked. Can they take a test? Yes. Anyone is eligible to take an exam as long as they fit the criteria of being eligible to take the exam. As long as they meet the criteria to go ahead and take the test, that's not an issue at all, meaning that they can't have illegal drugs or alcohol in their system and that they are adequately rested.
Now, another thing I've read is that by ingesting drugs or alcohol, it might be possible to throw off a polygraph examination. Is that also true?
Yes, people can attempt to go ahead and do that. It is referred to as a chemical countermeasure. And by countermeasure, I mean trying to beat the test. You're trying to counter affect the actual physiological data that comes from your body to the exam. And I always tell everyone, you would not try and beat the test if you knew you were going to pass, which is why during the pre-test interview, we discuss medications, where if an individual tells me they're not on any medications, they have no medical conditions, but I start to run the exam and the chart collection process, and I see that they're not reacting in the normal fashion, as I'll put it, that I can go ahead and suspect that there possibly is something chemical in their system, to which I will then address it with them and say, these are the chart findings, and I'll even sometimes show them the chart. This is what a normal chart looks like. This is what your chart looks like. What reason or what factor do you have for this looking the way that it does?
Now, would you be hesitant if you knew, and obviously hindsight is 2020, we're looking back at this case, which now stretches back for 37 years. Would you be more hesitant or cautious if you became aware of the fact that an individual you were giving a polygraph examination to had taken previous polygraph examinations that were inconclusive?
I've had that before, where examinees have taken exams with other examiners and they have been found either deceptive or inconclusive. And for me, what I like to do is leave that to the side because I wasn't there in the room. I wasn't there for the pre-test interview. I don't know the questions that were asked. I don't know what type of format that was used, because there are different types of polygraph formats that we use to collect data. And it also depends upon the testable issue and the format that the examiner chooses to go with. I like to go ahead and leave any predetermined dispositions that the examinee may have because of another examiner to the side. And then I will go ahead and run my own exam from start to finish on the basis of what information is provided to me at the time of the appointment.
Now, I know, again, I'm mixing in our 2024 knowledge of this suspect. We know he is a confirmed serial killer. This is Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. He's been linked via DNA by the Virginia State Police, the FBI, and the Hampton, Virginia Police Department to homicides of at least 3 people. The couple that I mentioned, Robin Edwards and David Knobling. Now he's been linked via DNA to Teresa Howell, who was murdered in 1989, about 2 years after the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling, and about a year after the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey. Would you approach that individual differently if you knew that he was a serial killer and that was confirmed? Obviously, we can't combine our knowledge from where we were in the 80s when this man was an active serial killer and perhaps extending well past that point, and what we know about him now. But if you knew someone was a serial killer, would you approach the exam in a different way?
I would approach it in terms of just like anyone else sitting across the table, because I don't want to go in and let him know what my cards are. I want to give him an opportunity. Again, like I mentioned, the polygraph is there to clear the innocent. I'm going to go ahead and give him the same lecture. You know what? Everyone's saying that this is what you are. I want to go ahead and confirm that you're not, because I want to give him the opportunity to be comfortable with me, to have a conversation, have a dialogue, possibly give me case information that the general public doesn't have because he slips up in a conversation. So if I can go ahead and establish rapport with him and advocate in that meeting to what he thinks is me being on his side and part of his defense team versus working for prosecution, I want to go ahead and level the playing field and get him comfortable to even get him to consent to take the test. Because if I can set that rapport, get him to consent to take the test, and if he fails, it's just further proof using the polygraph as an investigative tool that he is guilty and he is responsible for what he's being accused of.
And if he passes the test or it's inconclusive, that's an investigative tool and an investigative result as well. Is that fair?
So the investigative result of inconclusive means that I can't render an opinion. With regards to a polygraph, you're either passing or failing. It's like a pregnancy test. You're either pregnant, you're not pregnant. There's no such thing as a little bit of pregnant. There's no such thing a whole lot. So you have to it's one of the most common references that I can use with regards to explaining pass and fails. Sorry.
No, but, it's a good one.
It's more so in terms of the fact of the inconclusive being the gray area, where you're not all the way to the left, you're not all the way to the right. You fall in between the threshold of what I need. So if I need, let's say, a +3 or higher to pass, or a -3 or lower to fail, and you come in at a 0, +1 or +2, or -1 or -2, that's your inconclusive, your gray area. So I can't go ahead and have enough data to support a pass or a fail. So I rule it as a no opinion. And at that point, I will go ahead and offer the examinee a retest to say, listen, I'm not going to call you a liar, and I'm not going to call you as someone as being truthful or being honest or deceptive. I can't say it because I don't have the data to support it. So I want to give you the benefit of the doubt. I want you to go home, get a good night's rest, have breakfast in the morning, or make sure you eat during the day, and let's just go ahead and try this again. And at that point, I'll speak with either the law enforcement agency, or I'll speak with the therapist or whoever I'm working with that retained my services. And I'll say, listen, this is the situation. He's inconclusive or she's inconclusive. Let's try to take the same questions. Let's rephrase them a little bit. So that way they're not exactly the same, but we just change the language and maybe we'll be able to render an opinion that way on the basis of language.
How long does a polygraph examination take roughly?
So it should take minimum 90 minutes, which consists of a pre-test interview, the chart collection process, as well as a post-test interview, depending upon the investigation of what's going on, whether it's relationship or a theft, a murder. It all comes into different plays of how long the interview is going to be slated for, but it should take a minimum of 90 minutes.
Now, I want to be clear here. I want to read you something. I want to be explicit here.
Okay.
My father, Joe Thomas, who passed away a couple of years ago, dealt directly with the FBI agents who were investigating my sister Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's murder in 1986 as part of the Colonial Parkway Murders. They would be the start of the Colonial Parkway Murders as we know it. So my dad stayed in constant contact with these agents, so much so that I remember around the dinner table, I was almost 30 years old at the time of Kathy's death. Of all the family members, I was probably the most interested in the status of the investigation. We knew the FBI agents by name. My dad would say in his beautiful voice, I spoke to today. And then a couple of years later, I spoke to today. And he got to know these agents really well, and he really respected them, as do I. Now, I never met these gentlemen, but my dad told me the story that I told you about the polygraph examination in 1988. Many years later, when we were working on this Lover's Lane Murders television show for Oxygen, I met with Irvin Wells, who was the former SAC for the Norfolk FBI office, and I had 3 to 4 hours twice with Irv Wells in his living room while we were making the television series, because we shot it twice. Irv and I had hours while they were setting up the lights and the cameras and doing all the television stuff. So he and I talked about a number of things, and he went back over this story about the polygraph examination and how these gentlemen were dismissed, if you will, as suspects. And Blaine Pardo and Victoria Hester, 2 authors that did a great book on the Colonial Parkway Murders called A Special Kind of Evil. Blaine interviewed Irv Wells, who passed away in 2022. And here's what Blaine reports in his book. He said, Irv Wells felt the same frustration. So these guys really did look hot. He's talking about the suspects in the Colonial Parkway disappearance of Keith Cole and Cassandra Hailey. We brought in a polygrapher. He was one of the best the Bureau had. Anyway, blank something was his name. I'll leave that out. He was known as the Bureau's polygrapher extraordinaire, and he was responsible for polygraphing the John Walker case and other spy cases. And he said, these guys didn't do it. We said, you better effing be right. And we walked away from him, meaning the suspect. I have always wondered, to defeat a polygraph, you have to be more sophisticated than, and they were watermen. That was a big thing. They were watermen, which is what they said they were looking for as far back as 1986 when Kathy and Becky were killed. They said in 86 we're looking for watermen because of the rope, knives, handcuffs, and diesel fuel used in my sister's murder. Back to Irv Wells now. He said they didn't do it and didn't know about it. He's quoting the polygraph examiner. I respected him. It's just the way things go. You get frustrated. That's the way investigations go. You get some people that look great and something happens. Blaine continues, the hopes of closing both Call Hailey and possibly Thomas Dowski at the time ended with the polygrapher clearing the suspect. Is this how it works? The polygrapher doesn't get the result that we're looking for and we dismiss the subject?
The examiner is there to only render an opinion on the polygraphs that are ascertained from the physiological data of the examinee. They are then to turn over the results to the investigative team or whoever is asking for the exam, whichever agency it is, or whatever case agent, lead, etc. And from there, that's when it gets done. I have seen investigations get closed on the basis of polygraph results. I have seen investigations get opened on the basis of polygraph results. But it's not necessarily always on the basis of the polygraph results. It's usually, again, it's part of it as an investigative tool to validate the credibility of the individual taking the exam. There could have been other factors that we're not aware of as to just simply closing the case on the basis of the polygraph that we're not aware of. It could have been simply done on the basis of the exam, and they held weight to the credibility and the expertise and training of the examiner. I don't know who the examiner is. I can't speak to them. their efforts, whatever they've done. Personally, I do not like holding just the weight on the exam. I want something also to substantiate the results, to validate, again, using the polygraph as a tool in the process, because the investigation should have happened, which led them to the reason of wanting to give a polygraph exam.
I'm not going to dance on this one. I'm still disturbed given all the additional information that came out about this suspect, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., involving I'm going to call them what they were, attacks on other couples who were engaged in sexual or romantic behavior. He would come up, bang very aggressively on the window, and demand driver's license. In most stories I've heard, and I'm getting people coming out of the woodwork again 30-something years later as a result of this new information, and they're saying this man driving that truck engaged us in an extremely aggressive and frightening manner. Now, these people live to tell the tale, quite frankly, but they're clearly talking about this man in this truck. I'm just struggling with something, which is how in the world do you dismiss a suspect that even Irv Wells, may he rest in peace, says we were red hot on these guys and we let it go? Am I wrong to be baffled?
Absolutely not. And after speaking with you on the phone and at CrimeCon regarding the case and the investigation and where we're at and everything that you've told me, it irritates me, to be honest, as an investigator as well as an examiner, because if you have individuals that are working in an agency on a specific case and people have suspicions, why go ahead and discredit the thoughts of your own employees with their own findings that are actively working this case versus the opinion of just one examiner? So yes, there is the science, there is the research behind the accuracy of the examination. But to me, I've always said you can't beat the polygraph, but you can beat the examiner. Because if the examiner is not up to date on their continuing education pertaining to new methodologies of scoring, algorithms, in addition to different types of interview styles and techniques, we don't know what took place in the room. There are times where I will get a phone call from an attorney's office where they'll go ahead and say, listen, I have a client that took an exam with another examiner for a law enforcement agency. It's part of discovery. I want to contract you as a third-party consultant to do a quality control. And what that means is that's taking a look at the interview, which is audio and video recorded, in addition to the transcripts of whatever was done pertaining to the audio and video, as well as the actual charts themselves. And I just had it recently on a federal case. And I actually called up the attorney and I said, listen, the examiner that ran the test did it by the book 100%. And they were looking to me just to see if I can find any fault anywhere. And I said, you know what? This is the model, the ideal, the standard of which I would want an exam conducted. And I work as a polygraph instructor. I travel the country to teach at law enforcement agencies about polygraph. Not even just about methodology, but also standards of practice and ethics and how to be an ethical examiner. And what do you do when you get put into awkward situations where maybe your agency wants you to do one thing, but you know that in your heart and in your mind, this is the right thing to do. So it comes down to also pressure given by superiors sometimes when you have to render an opinion. The examiners need to stay strong and they need to trust the data that they have that's in front of them and render the appropriate decisions.
Lisa, I can't thank you enough for being with us on Mind Over Murder today.
Of course, I'm having a blast. I'm so glad we finally got a chance to do this because you and I have been talking about this case for about almost 2 years now. And as soon as you posted on social media pertaining to these new updates, I couldn't have reached out to you any quicker and be like, we have to talk. I just wish Kristin was here, and I hope Kristin's having a great time listening. And we'll definitely have to revisit this as more case developments go on.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
That's it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Kristin Dilley will be back with us next time. Thanks for listening.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.